Talk of travel inevitably leads us to talk of home, what it means to leave home, what it means to return, how our view of that place we call home changes as a result of our travels. The home in this picture is one of several that Charles Dickens occupied in his time living in London. It's now the Charles Dickens Museum. And Dickens traveled all around the world as a very famous writer. And he once noted that every traveler has a home of their own, and they learn to appreciate it more from their wanderings. That was certainly the case for him. So let's talk about what we learn to appreciate. So what is home? What do we mean by the word home? The photo in this slide is of the poet Maya Angelou and the civil rights activist Malcolm X. This was at a time when Angelou was living in Ghana in the 1960s, and she wrote a lot about feeling at home in Ghana, even though it wasn't the place of her birth. And one of the things she had to say was that the ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned. That home is that safe place. And I want to focus on 3 ways in which we feel safe in a particular place. And the first literally has to do with the notion of place, to be in one's place, to feel as though a place belongs to you and you belong to it. And from that, we get a sense of home. Very often, it's a place that we associate with childhood or origins, but it may be a place where we just feel a strong sense of cultural connection, where we feel at home the moment we arrive there. The second is the kind of psychological aspect of home, to feel at home in one's mind or to feel in one's right mind. In other words, that the place that we are makes us feel that our thoughts are our own rather than simply being a response to external forces, that we feel in sync with ourselves in a particular place. And our thoughts feel, if not necessarily at ease, they feel right. They feel as though they belong to us. And then the third has to do with community, being at home in one's company. In other words, with others, feeling as though we belong to a group, to a cohort, to a community, whether it's a town or a village or a family or a country or whatever the case may be. That sense of identification with the place, but also with the people in that place, and the way that we feel in our own minds in that place. And these are 3 defining features of home. Of course, the primary way that we know home is through contrast to other places we've been, or what I'm referring to here as away. In the Odyssey, Odysseus comments, "I pine all my days to travel home and see the dawn of my return." Return to home, to Ithaca, which is featured in this photograph here, the island where Odysseus was from and the place to which he sought return. I particularly love that phrase, the dawn of my return, this idea of returning home as being a kind of rebirth or renewal, the beginning of a new day, as opposed to the end of something, the sunsetting of something in return. And there are several ways that we can sort of contrast the difference between what it means to be away and what it means to be home. And one of the simplest ones is to simply think about the mindset that we take up when we're away. When we're away, everything is an adventure. There are new challenges that face us every day. There are new problems that we need to solve. There are new experiences that we're going to be having. Whereas home is a place that we associate with routine, with a certain pattern of a day, right? Even when different things happen to us, even when we are having sort of little adventures, they always fit within a familiar pattern of some sort for us, that we know that eventually we will return to our own bed, or that we will be able to sort of touch home base, and it creates this sort of sense of routine. The second is that when we're away, we are travelers. And a traveler is someone who is experiencing something that, even when it seems familiar to them, is new. That they don't belong to the place. They're there to have an experience in that place. They're always sort of transient figures. as opposed to home where we are native. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we were born there, that it is the place of our nativity, but it is a place that we feel that we belong to and that belongs to us, which gives us an entirely different sense of ownership about it. And the third way is to think about home as a place where we are sort of experts, right? Where we know how things are done, where things belong, etc. It gives us a strong sense of confidence and competence, and perhaps even a certain level of complacency, as opposed to being away where we feel like amateurs, which is to say, inexperienced, not knowledgeable necessarily, but I think even more importantly, to the root word of that meaning amateur, which comes from the same French root as the word amour or love, that we are lovers, right? That we are expressing a passion for something in travel when we're away, whereas at home there's something somewhat more dispassionate. Of course, one of the consequences of travel is that when you return home, your attitude about it has changed because your perspective has been broadened, which is why the early 20th century writer Thomas Wolfe once said, "You can't go home again." Or more eloquently, the later 20th century writer James Baldwin commented, "You don't have a home until you leave it, and then when you have left it, you can never go back." And Baldwin was speaking from very personal experience here. Baldwin grew up in Harlem, New York. As a young man, he moved to Europe, where he wrote many of his early and successful works, and only returned to the United States in the 1960s because he was troubled by what he was seeing in the news, and particularly to do with the civil rights movement. And he came back to document the movement, but also to opine on the subject of institutional racism and the history of racism in America, and he had to return to his own country to do that. When he returned to Harlem, he visited old familiar places and felt a sense of home, but also felt displaced from it, that he had been changed and that the place, at least in his eyes, had changed. So there are ways of looking at this change positively. The Chinese philosopher Confucius is said to have said at one point, "To know the road ahead, ask those coming back," by which he meant those who have adventured out have something to tell us about the future, have something to tell us about what is ahead for us, not even specifically what is out there in the world, but what is possible, because the adventure represents the idea of change, of transformation. And that is what the road ahead offers us. And it's something that we as travelers can return home with, which is something I spoke about in another lecture. One of my favorite quotes about home is from the espionage writer John le Carré, who said that home is where you go when you run out of homes. And this sounds like a sort of sarcastic or cynical remark, as though we've kind of burned through relationships and homes and eventually land in a place that will tolerate us, or however you want to sort of look at that. But I see it somewhat differently, that we venture through our lives calling many places home, but our true home is something that actually exists out in front of us rather than behind us. It's not something we're returning to, it's a place we're going to, which to me seems a very sort of positive and optimistic view. In other words, the traveler is the one who may not necessarily be seeking home, but eventually finds that home somewhere in the future. To dig a little deeper into this, I want to look at a quote from one of my favorite Roman philosophers, philosophers, a guy named Seneca, who says, "Things that were hard to bear are sweet to remember." And essentially what he's talking about here is the way we construct memory, right? That we live through our lives and there's a lot of struggle, etc. But when we recollect those things, there's a fondness about them. This is particularly true in travel, I think, that we go out into the world and it's a struggle to do so. Everything is work. We're constantly on our guard. It's very difficult to find places of comfort, whether we're traveling for a week or a year or 10 years. We are busy. We are often tired. We are often struggling. And while we are also having very strong, powerful, emotional, often very positive experiences, we're also having a lot of negative and banal and difficult ones as well. But when we return home from those travels, they become sweet memories. In other words, home becomes a repository for the sort of precious elements of travel for us. It becomes a place where a container for our memories, a way for us to recollect through an act of reconstruction and to find comfort in our experiences.